The red light indicates recording.
Well, that's good to know. I will know that for the future.
Yeah. So
cool. I mean,
we
now
can
it's
actually
a comfortable
it's
cool. It's a comfortable transition. Let's go with it.
Cool. So thank you all for joining me. Normally I would be doing this by myself in a dark room, just kind of yelling at the void.
Oh, good.
Well, that's lovely.
It's a really weird living situation. So, yeah.
Good. Well, we're glad that you don't have to do this by yourself in a dark room. Now you're in a room with 6 other people and there's lights. So
yeah.
Oh my.
An improved situation.
Oh my.
All right. Have you ever seen that George Takei
Yes.
case? Yes, it's glorious.
Immediately what I thought of.
But so we have a couple people here. Some of them have been here for the first week of the COP, which have we defined that yet?
No.
Yeah. So the United Nations has this framework convention on climate change, and at that they have a subsect of things called the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties. This is the 25th one of those. And overall, it's been a good time, but we're going to start off with Jack to give just a little bit of background about what they've been doing here.
Yeah. So, I guess Shelby said earlier, the COP meets every year in December. There are 2 weeks of it, and so me and Haley and partially Christian were there for the first week, and then we're going to pass it on to the second week people. But so during the first week, some of the big topics that have been going on have been like negotiations among the different parties, which are just representatives from every nation. And there have been some topics ranging from Article 6, which I'm sure we can get into later and kind of unpack. It's a very complex...
Definitely going to get into that.
Yeah,
later.
A very complex portion of the Paris Agreement that is still unresolved. Some conversations on funding loss and damage for like underdeveloped nations. And those are kind of the highlights, and there are some small ones we can get into. But in addition to negotiations, and Haley can maybe talk about this because she went to some, in addition to negotiations, there are side events that are put on by NGOs, governments that are open to all observers.
So what is an NGO? Just real quick so that way people have an understanding.
A non-governmental organization. So pretty much any entity that isn't like a government. So
at COP there were several universities that were a part of the NGO constituency. There were also a number of different non-governmental organizations like the American Chemical Society or several several environmental groups that are not associated with the government but still work as like a private group to better environmental causes.
One thing for our listeners out there, whenever we say state, that does not mean like Texas or insert other U.S. state here. That means like nation. So just a little nomenclature for everyone.
Nation state, member state, both of those are kind of the official terms for what a country is called.
Yeah. Americans are just weird.
This is fair.
I can say that. I am one.
Yeah. So what's a side event?
A side event. So side events are held, like Jack said, by either countries or non-governmental organizations. The World Wildlife Foundation had a pavilion, which is kind of like a little area that they set up that's associated with that group. So several countries have them, and then the World Wildlife Foundation is an example of a non-governmental organization that had one as well. And then there are also official side events which take place just in general rooms that aren't associated with a specific country or NGO. And the general side events will have members from multiple different countries oftentimes, or different NGOs come and speak on a panel about a certain topic. And then the side events that are held at a pavilion usually have more to do specifically with that country or that NGO's main cause. And a lot of times what those look like is a number of presenters, 2 or 3 presenters will get up and give like a 15-minute kind of scientific spiel, like a science speech almost. But usually they're a little bit more socially focused than like hard science, like chemistry or bio or things like that. And so they'll give 2 or 3 of those presentations, and then there will usually be a panel of some sort that will interact with the audience and ask questions and have a conversation at the end of it to kind of close it out.
It's kind of the same structure that I noticed in the Green Zone with the Modern Nostrum.
So what is the Green Zone?
So the Green Zone is the area open to the public who have observer passes and aren't necessarily delegates and things like that. If you can't get into the blue zone where a lot of the negotiations and real talks are happening, the green zone's a good place to learn about different renewable energy companies. There's a place where they have science demonstrations, mostly for children, talking about the difference between deforested and forested land and how they absorb water. And there were a lot of really interesting panels talking about equity in public transportation, how like women with children, it's harder for a woman holding a baby to hold a bar on the subway and not fall over with one hand. And a lot of environmental and social justice themed talks about different countries and particular issues that were a really good way for the community members to interact with delegates and NGO members, and some secretaries and other dignitaries who are going to bring a different perspective and be able to share kind of across those political lines. It was a really cool experience to listen to.
Yeah.
That's an awesome definition of that green zone thing. So we are actually able to go into what's known as the blue zone, which is where the member states, a lot of the NGOs get to go because we are sponsored by the American Chemical Society, and we have some of their spots for member observers. And our doctors, Foy and Peterman, who are not here at the moment, actually also get to go in because they have press credentials, which is really cool.
So press credentials are a little bit different than the passes that we have. So there's a number of different, levels of access, I would say, within the Conference of the Parties. And so, like Amanda said before, the green zone is kind of an area for the general public. And so people who live in the area have been traveling to the conference to go and observe things happening in the green zone. That's why there are a lot of children and a lot of families in that area. And then an observer pass, which is something that we have, is there. I think this year there are about 8,000 observer passes granted. And in the past, the number that they've permitted has varied. But this year actually has a fairly high observer count compared to past years. And basically that means we're allowed, like Baxter said, into different side events, into some negotiations and things like that. A press pass is like one level higher, where people with press passes can actually get into the press conferences that are closed to observers. And so there's a number of different things, like I believe Nancy Pelosi came to speak, and that was a press conference, and so only press were allowed in, and observers are not allowed into those. And then at any point, so the next highest level, or the highest level really, I guess, is a party, and that means you are a delegate of a specific country, and those are the people who actually attend negotiations on behalf of the country, and so they have a very different level of access, obviously, than the rest of us. So the interesting thing about being an observer is that while most negotiations and events are going to be open to us to begin with, any party at any point can ask the room to be closed to observers, and all the observers will have to leave the room. And so a number of events and negotiations have been closed toward the end of week one. And that would be because things are kind of getting closer to the end and getting a little bit more tense at the end of these negotiations. And so a lot of times parties will ask observers to leave because there are different, either really political things being said or things that want to be discussed that not everybody has access to. And then additionally, we've noticed that some events, even some side events, have been closed to observers, like the gender related events have been closed, which has been interesting.
Yeah, there was some interesting drama with there was a climate change and gender negotiation that went on that ended up being closed for a couple sessions and then reopened later, and we couldn't have getting clarification on why. So they really just have the ability, if they don't want to say something that will look bad on them, or they just like don't want observers to be like completely up to date and everything, to just like kick them out of the room. Although it's, I think, generally looked down upon, and I think the executive secretary tries to prevent that as much as possible. But
It creates a lack of transparency too, if you're not.
Right.
Yeah, I did hear at the beginning of one of the last days of the Article 6 negotiations, which we've mentioned a number of times. Article 6 is a pretty highly debated part of the Paris Agreement right now, and the negotiations have been pretty tense. And so towards the end of the week, we were all kind of anticipating that observers might start to get kicked out of some of the meetings. But at the very beginning of one of the last negotiations, the co-chair or the facilitator started his opening speech by saying, we've had a really good track record of keeping the observers in the room, and I really hope that we can continue in that pattern today. But because I have to ask, does anybody want observers to be like removed from the room? And nobody spoke up. So it was really interesting that even the co-facilitator of the whole event was like really excited and wanted for the observers to continue to stay in the room because like you said, it just creates more transparency that way. So I think that it is definitely something that not just the observers want, but the people who are a part of these negotiations really want that as well.
That's awesome. I have a couple of questions for you guys, but I'm going to hold those for a minute and open the floor up to Yasmin. So what's something you are curious about going into week 2 that these guys might be able to answer? That's all right. It's worth noting, anyone listening to this, I did not prime them on any questions or what I might be talking about.
It's just on the spot.
Absolutely. So
I guess what surprised you guys the most about the negotiations? Because this is something that, I mean, not many of us have had experience attending a negotiation before like this.
No, what surprised me the most is like, it's just kind of like walking into the middle of a conversation that everyone's having. And so you kind of have to do some research before and be a little bit up to date on, for example, the Article 6 negotiations. You have to know what exactly they're talking about, where the latest draft of that document is, because they are actively editing it and making suggestions during the negotiations. And so on my first day, I attended it with Lucas, who isn't at this session, but he had his draft text pulled up, he had his notes pulled up, and he was writing away, and I was not aware of that. And so he showed me where I can find the draft text, which is, it's kind of buried on the UNFCCC website. And basically that's just the latest updates on what they're going to be talking about and implementing. So that's what I would say is most surprising, is just the lack of up-to-date or the lack of accessibility for the observers to be up to date on what's going on during the negotiations.
I will note though that they do make a really big effort to make sure that the drafts are somewhere. So I think that one of my challenges was just being so new to it that I didn't know where to find these things. And so while there is like a challenge with accessibility, it is important to note that it isn't inaccessible. They do make sure that the drafts are somewhere. It's just challenging to find them if you don't know how to navigate like their database kind of. But there is a Twitter account.
Yeah, I like overheard someone talking about a Twitter account and showing their friend, and it basically just tweets out the most recent drafts of whatever negotiations are going on. So you can basically just see what's going on. I'd have to double check on what the name of that is. I think it's just like latest drafts at UNFCCC negotiations.
We can retweet that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So make it more accessible that way. But that's one of the efforts that's being made to increase that accessibility.
All right.
That's a good idea.
So Shelby, you were here last year. You've heard some of what they said. How does all that line up?
So it seems about right. I'm jealous that you guys have gotten to go to so many negotiations because I only got to go to one last year because most of them were closed to observers during week 2, just because there were some disagreements from some major parties. And so the negotiations that were had were really tense, and so they didn't want any observers there. So I am a little jealous that you guys got to go to that. I'm really excited to see how it's all going to play out this year, since they agreed on most everything except for Article 6. So I am now very curious and excited to see how they are going to talk about that. In terms of just the conference itself, I only went for a few moments on Saturday, but last year there were no green zone and blue zone. It was all one together. And so everybody got to be kind of in the same space. However, what was new is that they didn't allow the general public in at all. That's what's new this year, is that they are actually being more transparent and being more open, and in terms of kind of letting the public in and letting them see what's going on, which I think is really important, that they have that transparency. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, in terms of how the negotiations are going to go, since I didn't actually get to participate in that a lot last year, I'm not really sure what to expect on that aspect. But yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think all of us would agree that transparency is a really important thing. And like, I know one thing that I try to do as a scientist is work on ways that I can communicate science to the public, because honestly, none of us are going to solve these large challenges that we're facing as a world, like climate change, if we keep it contained to the scientists or the policymakers, or the people who are deemed allowed to know this information. Like, it's so important. And that's why I'm excited about the Green Zone. I'm excited about some of the things that they've been doing this year. They even brought in some local artists from Spain, and they created a bunch of really incredible like designs, almost like fashion designs, that they had mannequins in, and all of them were local Spaniard artists that like used the clothing to kind of describe their passion for the ocean or their passion for the climate or whatever, and kind of expressed their love of that through their artwork. And I just think that's a really creative way to get people involved who aren't just scientists, aren't just policymakers, but are really like the heart and soul of the community. As Spain has mentioned at a number of different events, or different representatives of Spain have mentioned that to be Spaniard is to be a part of the ocean. Like, the ocean it plays a really primary role in their community here. Because they do depend pretty heavily, some of their coastal cities depend pretty heavily on the ocean for their source of food. And so I think that it's been really interesting just to see the way that Spain has been adding like the Green Zone and different interactions, and increasing the number of observers that are allowed to try and create that transparency with the actual community.
Another really awesome thing that I've seen this year is the pushing of like VR technology, both in the Green Zone and the Blue Zone, to give people that immersive experience to see what situations are going on currently in the world and what the potential for other situations to occur if climate change like continues to cause drastic problems. Like, I've done a couple of different VR simulations, and one of them was with a papaya farmer who was having trouble growing crops because of the drought that he was experiencing. And so you could see the papaya farmer face to face, and it was kind of like you were an observer in his daily life and the conversations he was having with people. And that really establishes like more of a human connection with these issues that we're facing. And so I thought that was really valuable. And then in the Green Zone, we got to experience like being someone in Madrid or Barcelona, one of those cities, in the year like 50 years from now, and everything was flooded. They're experiencing a heavy rainstorm, and they said this is just basically like another day in our city, and instead of being able to drive down the streets, we have to take emergency vehicles to get to work and stuff like that. So it's just pretty powerful experience. I don't know if you experienced that last year at COP24.
Yeah, I didn't get to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool way to use that technology, and I hope to see more of it in the future.
So it seems like we're structuring a lot here on reframing these issues of climate change away from just their traditional viewpoint. I had a conversation with Dr. Peterman and Shelby earlier about a lot of these same issues that will probably go out sometime tomorrow, maybe the day after. Depends on how exhausted Ian is after his finals. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Awesome,
Ian.
Ian.
You're the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're trying to reframe this entire thing. That's one of the reasons we're here. We're the Students on Climate Change, currently rebranding the Climate Conversations, I think. But we're going through and blogging, documenting all the things we see. We're here at the COP, and now we're doing podcasts. So if we're working really hard to try and reframe these things, what's one thing we should try to focus on, Jack?
I think something that's really important with this is reaching outside of our current bubble. In my community back home, I am definitely one of the very few people that are concerned about these kind of issues and are like knowledgeable of it, just because it's just something that I follow. It's my passion, but it's not necessarily like a cultural focus from where I'm from. And I think that it's really easy for when we're at this table and when we're talking with our friends who like are also have the same passions as us to come to consensus. But I think that something that is really important about what we're trying to do communications-wise with this project is we're reaching out to everybody that's in our network, everyone who we have back home and abroad, and kind of getting more exposure to these issues and to kind of the current culture of climate justice to people who maybe wouldn't traditionally follow it. And I think that's kind of what I see my role in this and our role in social media, all of this.
Cool.
I think to add to that also, like what Christian brought up, there's a really powerful tool of having people sympathize with what other people are experiencing, because we live in areas where, our communities aren't necessarily being flooded, and we don't have droughts that affect our way of life and our community's ability to survive. And so it's just really hard, I think, for a lot of people to be able to conceptualize and understand the gravity of what's happening to real people and real communities. And so through technology and experiences like that, hopefully that can help give some exposure and help create some understanding. And I think that leads into a really important part of what some of the panels I was at were talking about too, that education on these issues is really important, not just education about, climate change is happening, weather patterns are changing, all of these very proven scientific observations that we can make, and all of the really devastating projections and predictions, right, that are happening. But one interesting thing in one of the panels that I was at, one of the public members or observers brought up education about different types of renewable energies and help making that more accessible and understandable to public, because a lot of people have misconceptions about different kinds of energy sources, and helping people understand how it works and making it more accessible, I think, is also part of the solution. Because if it's not something that is a mystery, right, then it's more open and it's more welcome, maybe.
Right.
But education is a really important part. And I actually took a class this January about climate change. We read a lot of really fantastic books. And one of the things that a lot of our class members were talking about too was that we all wish that we would have had some kind of environmental education in elementary school, just learning about like some of those scientific demonstrations I was seeing in the green zone. This is what water looks like in the aquifer when you have deforestation, and the differences in just natural processes like that happening, but learning about water conservation and energy conservation and just small things that we all can do as a part of our daily life. But
yeah, and that's something I've seen a lot through. I'm part of my local ACS chapter, and one of the things we like to do is go out into the community and put on magic shows. These magic shows are just a bunch of really flashy or innovative science demonstrations to try and get people involved and understanding all the things that are around them in the world. One of our favorites that's pretty new is to just take like a roll of aluminum foil and drop a really strong magnet down it, and it'll fall super slowly. And everyone has a roll of foil at their house, or a good portion of people. So it's very relatable. It's using hands-on objects that people can relate to. We're going to call it here for a moment, take a little bit of a break and get some water. But thanks for listening in. Tuning in a second.